Welcome to Reanimated. It's the episode where we continue to talk about Interview with the Vampire Season 2, but this one's episode 4. I'm Stuart. Joining me from New York. Actually, no. Where are you? Connecticut? H.A. Conrad?
I'm in the wilds of Connecticut. Yep.
The Connecticutonian wilds.
Hmm.
Wow, fantastic news. I'm glad that you were able to podcast on the road, as it were, from our mobile headquarters.
I mean, I take this so seriously. I am not going to let anybody down.
Thank you. And I appreciate that. And that's the kind of professionalism we both bring to this operation.
Totally. Totally.
Not a whole ton of news going on. Not even your breadcrumbs from 28 years later, really. Although there's still some news being generated by the excitement around that new trilogy. But we have a couple of things to talk about before we can get into Interview with the Vampire Season 2, Episode 4, which is entitled "I Love You More Than Anything in the World." These two articles are one from Screen Rant, another from a blog called Geek Tyrant. Screen Rant writes, sorry, I can't not laugh. Get ready for the zombie movie Renaissance, or Renaissance, depending on where you'd like to emphasize that.
Yep.
If these
Yep.
two upcoming sequels are successful. And can anybody out there guess which two sequels they're talking about? When you read that
Oh.
headline, HA, were you able to guess which sequels?
Yeah, I was pretty sure which ones they were talking about. But
Well, yeah.
I mean, the first one definitely. The second one, I'm like,
Yes.
eh.
28 years
Okay.
later is a gimme, and that franchise that's coming back. That's a gimme because of the star power behind it, etc. I Am Legend 2 is their other pick, and I think I might have been tempted to say George Romero's final film or
Yeah, agree.
something along those lines. But honestly, his movies have never really they sparked a movement, but they've never been resuscitation machines, you know.
I also thought that the comment that there's been a dearth of zombie films out there, I'm like,
Yeah, I mean, yes, the last 3 years, yes.
yeah, but I guess, I think part of it is that I think of it in a slightly different way because obviously there was the pandemic issue. So a lot of things got slowed down, obviously, but there's been a lot of content more on the show side, I guess. Um, but anyway, it's all good.
Yeah.
28 years later, I'll take it. I don't know. I am Legend 2, I guess. But, it's Screen Rant. So this is what they do. They just want to spot trends, put them out there. It's fine. But I'm very curious to see what the next sort of like the breadcrumbs about 28 years later is. Like, I do enjoy how they keep just sort of like, stirring up the hype machine for it. It's kind of fun.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
last week we were talking about Aaron Taylor Johnson, right? Like that it was
yeah,
filming in some island off the coast of England, and it could be something. More casting announcements, I think, are kinds of things we could look forward to. More people reporting that they're filming in XY location. But
yeah,
at some point, it's coming out next summer, I think, is what we determined.
yep,
We don't want to know too much, but a
no,
trailer will probably drop maybe this time next year,
yeah.
or a little earlier. I I'm unreasonably excited about it.
I mean, look, with the people involved and the fact that Cillian Murphy is now attached not just as like a producer, but as, part of it.
Yeah,
I'm pretty excited about it. I trust them. We'll see what happens. I think it's gonna be good. And then the other news item, which is like kind of not funny, but like very Zack Snyder, even in how the article plays out, is about how Netflix really wants him to do more Rebel Moon movies, but he just wants to do more Army of the Dead movies, right? Is that was the gist of it?
that's what he's telling Looper
Yeah.
that when he did an interview with them. And this is funny because I think I would say like 9 out of 10 people, maybe not 9 out of 10, maybe 7 to 8 people out of 10 agree that Rebel Moon was pretty bad.
Yeah, yeah.
Army of the Dead isn't like changing people's lives out there, but it was at least not as bad as Rebel Moon 1 and 2.
Yeah. But there
So
must have been enough people that thought it was successful for
I
them to
think
want
I think
more.
people were watching it because of the writer's strike and the lack of
Yeah,
actual
probably.
content out there. Like all those all those people who were saying, "Oh my gosh, this writer strike is going to create a huge dearth of content in general," they weren't wrong. Like there has been a real shortage of I think of original content or original production stuff coming out of streaming platforms in the last quarter. And Rebel Moon was one of the very few, and it was, high profile and very promoted. Have you seen them though? Either of those movies?
Which one? The Rebel Moon one?
Yeah, the Rebel Moon ones.
Yes, I saw the first one.
Right.
But
Because
also wasn't all that wild about it.
it
Yeah.
was pretty mediocre. And then the second one just doubled down on that. And yeah, so it was Rebel Moon was bad, but it was like the only thing around for miles. And so people watched it. And I think that's probably maybe one of the things that Netflix is responding to, if I
Yeah.
had to speculate.
Hmm.
Whereas Army of the Dead came out, there was a bunch of other stuff going on. It was during COVID. Well, people were still at home a lot. And I
Yep.
think it probably, well, I don't know.
Captive audience.
I would have thought that yeah would have made it a better audience and better numbers than Rebel Moon, but who knows? So Netflix really wants him to do more Rebel Moon. Snyder really wants to get back to Army of the Dead. The Reanimated stance on this is we too would like more Army of the Dead, as long as Snyder hires an editor and a writer,
True.
and he can handle
Hmm.
the visuals, and that would be great. So that's kind of out there. It is encouraging to hear that Snyder wants to get back into zombies. I will always be grateful to him for 2004 Dawn of the Dead. But that kind of brings us to, unless you want to talk about the anything else.
Nope, I think we're good, and we're gonna hop into episode 4 of Interview with the Vampire season 2.
I love you more than anything in the world.
Yep.
This season has had very long episode titles.
Yes. And sometimes the episodes feel like they're very long, and this was no exception.
Okay. Yeah, so kind of three out of the last three have felt pretty long to both of us. I'm trying to, interrogate my feelings about this and say to myself, well, what is it they're trying to do? They're trying to make this coven experience in Paris feel like more than a flash in the pan, which is what I think it did feel like in the film version of this that came out a long
Hmm.
time ago, and in my memory, my distant memory of the books. They're dragging it out is the wrong verb to use, but they are prolonging this sensation of like a gradual collapse of this organization. And
Right.
but I think they're doing it in an interesting way. So as much as this feels a little long, as much as it is a little slow, I am interested in everything that's happening with these
Oh, me too.
characters.
Me too. And I thought that the scenes between Louis and Figment of his imagination, Lestat, were really interesting.
Really engaging. Well, because he actually engages with Lestat, right?
Right. Um,
Yeah,
I really actually liked the Claudia storyline in this and watching how this is unfolding for her. And so
yeah.
that's kind of interesting.
I started to remember. I feel like the Claudia in other versions of this story, doesn't she turn someone to be her mom or something? And
Yeah, well,
that's
so that's what a little bit of what we were talking about in terms of the creative decision to make her more like a preteen or maybe an early teen in
yeah,
this versus a child. So in the book, she is so young that she cannot go like out unaccompanied, and that is part of what the that's part of why the sort of law is in place is that amongst the vampires is that um you shouldn't be making somebody who cannot survive on their own as like a vampire. I would say that's debatable just because they're so powerful and things like that. Like I could see ways around that even if you are a child vampire, but I get the drift of what they're trying to say.
hmm,
And so basically Claudia makes Louis or convinces him to make the seamstress, which I guess is the stand-in that we're seeing here, slightly different because in the story it's like a woman who lost her daughter sees Claudia as sort of like a replacement for that and somebody that will never go away, never die, and that she can make clothes for. And so essentially, it's like her companion. So that because Claudia does not want like this sort of unfolds because of you know, she sees Louis' attachment with Armand and others, and so she's like, "Well, how am I going to survive? And you need to do this for me if you love me." And the whole point is that she can't make a vampire on her own because she doesn't have the blood volume to do it. And so that was kind of an interesting twist
Huh.
in that particular story that they can't, you know. And so anyway, that like so they've changed this a little bit,
Yeah.
and I'm not necessarily
It's not going to play out exactly the same way, but they're
well,
building
no, because
toward it.
because they're building a very different kind of relationship between
Well, do you feel
Claudia.
like it's sexual?
Um, I feel like it might be, but I also feel like it's like a very specific understanding.
Yeah. Just
And
two ostracized outcasts who are kind of drawn to each
right.
other.
But I also think that the sort of the problem or the problem they need to solve for here, or why the coven doesn't make vampires at like in the teenage years, and we heard Armand say this in the last episode, is that they are not like they are not fully formed enough mentally. They go off the deep end
Yeah.
and things like that. So that's sort of the take on this that they're putting into it. And so that's like a slightly different way of looking at it. So I think they're definitely going to see more of that, and they're already starting to play this up in this episode. So I don't mind this take on it. I think it does make it more interesting to some extent. But I also thought that um, the other version of this is also very interesting because I think you get more of a sense that she's a child trapped in, or a woman trapped in a child's body in the other, that like she's this ancient being and she looks like she's like 8, you know?
Right.
And in this, she isn't fully formed, and that's true. And maybe that is even trickier because she's like kind of right on the cusp
Hmm.
of being an adult, and that feels almost like it was unfair that it was stolen from her. And she certainly feels that that's unfair. So I think that that's a nuanced way of looking at it, and honestly, kind of cool. And I will say, um, Delaney is playing this to the hilt, and she's really good. And I really thought that her performance in this episode was just, you could feel every single bit of disappointment and stress and kind of like depression. And it's weird because she's with this group of vampires where they can be who they are, but she ultimately feels even more trapped with them than she did with Louis and Lestat. So at least with Louis and Lestat, she kind of had more freedom
Yeah, she could
just to
go out
be
and
out in the
hunt.
world, right?
Right. Yeah.
So so anyway, but she's really, really good. So I won't gush more, but I want to hear what you think about it.
Well, about her storyline, yes, I agree. And Delaney Hales is totally swinging for in this one, and I like the fact that I like the storyline where she's doing her play. The first one, you do get to see how excited she is to be on stage, and
Hmm.
then they show you the progression of her performance, just kind of taking a turn for much more humdrum because it's the 500th performance. That's also how they're passing showing the passage of time, and you get to see Armand in his role as the company director or whatever taken her to task for her performance and Louis not really doing anything to intervene. I thought that that was a very interesting scene too.
Hmm.
You get to see part of that rigor of
Hmm.
Armand, which we have talked about, and which I think this show still needs to, and we're building to it because there's stuff happening in all of the parts of this story in Dubai and in Paris that show that he is not always the lover of Louis. He's obviously got other facets to him, and that was quite interesting.
Yeah, and this is also, sort of the deal Louis made that if she's going to be a part of this, he can't intervene. So there's that too.
Yeah, he doesn't seem that like stuck in
Bothered by
any.
it.
Yeah, well, he doesn't seem bothered by what's happening, although he mentions it later to
Hmm.
Armand, but he doesn't speak up in front of the coven, which I guess is
Right.
him kind of playing the role of I'm
Yeah.
not trying to rock the boat.
Hmm.
But obviously, the in that same scene, other members of the coven cast and crew start to, you know, say, "Hey, why is this one guy able to do whatever he wants?" Um, and so we're starting to see a lot of the cracks in the foundation here between
Mm.
Louis, who is not held in the same in enclosure as the rest of the coven, and they're mad about it. And it's also
Yeah.
arbitrary. Like this is Armand is just like doing what he was told to do 400 years ago by a bunch of Italian vampires when he was sent to Paris. He basically divulges that in this episode, and you're just like, my God, man, why are you so unimaginative?
And Lestat showed him a different way, and he could have gone that way and chose not to. And again, I would like to see a little bit more about the circumstances of Lestat's departure. It could just be that Lestat's like, I'm bored with all this nonsense and took off, which you could see, but it could be that he was driven out. Um, we'll see how that will play out in the end. I do want to go back to one thing though about Claudia and this role that they have put her in, and there is okay. Armand can read minds. He knows people's weaknesses. I think he definitely knows that putting her in this role and having this be what she's doing is going to put her over the edge, or it is kind of deliberately cruel. Because even though she's like, especially in the beginning, it is beautiful what they do in this production. Very cool, like with the way they're sort of putting her and interposing her into these like film scenes or like the animations behind her. Um, and she's really good at it. So I think she enjoys at first being on stage. But the theme of this, she has been uncomfortable with since the minute they um, unveiled what this role was. And I think Armand is being quite deliberate in this. And I think he's jealous of Claudia. I think that he um, wants to put a definite wedge between her and Louis. And I may be wrong about it, but I think that that's what he's doing. So for someone who seems so concerned about whether she's going to be stable or go into madness, he's doing, I think he's doing a pretty good job at leading her there or making sure that she's set up to go there. Um,
Yep.
and like, so that is just like kind of an interesting thing. And not just like her worst insecurities, not just on stage, but even when she goes out in public, everybody knows her as this baby character. So it's like basically she cannot get away from it. And it's constantly in her face. It's like you're always going to be this like child. So anyway, I
Even,
think,
I mean, I feel like Armand even says it in Dubai that it was a punishment. It was
yeah.
I forget what word he used exactly, but like making her wear the dress as a punishment
Mm-hmm.
for her performance slipping was him trying to enrage her, trying to get her
Mm-hmm.
to flip. And yeah, it basically that's the only thing I can think of that it's out of also is the a wedge between her and Louis, and it works.
Yep.
And
So
and
anyway,
so does Louis' ongoing relationship with Armand. Although
yes.
there's another player in this relationship, we knew about it last episode. This
Yeah.
one, Lestat is still in the room. I like the way that they introduced the fact that he's there in a
Mm-hmm.
conversation between Louis and Armand, where they're like having a quiet conversation. You just see a shadow move in front of the camera, um, and like there's a couple of just like kind of, oh, there's somebody else in the room, sort of things happening, and then
Mm-hmm.
you're like, oh, it's Lestat, and Louis doing a better job of not acknowledging him because in the
Yep.
last episode he had screamed at him in a restaurant.
Mm-hmm.
And now Lestat is being really annoying, mocking Louis and Armand's relationship. And Louis waits until Armand leaves the room to be like, "You said you weren't going to talk." So it's kind of unhinged, and I like the fact that Malloy is also like, "Louis, are you a schizophrenic?" And it's clear that Armand also wasn't even aware as Louis starts to describe the feelings that
Mm-hmm.
he had when Lestat was in the room. Armand in Dubai in the present is like, I didn't know it was quite that intense.
Yeah. Especially when it's really intimate moments, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, that's kind of funny.
But yeah, so Louis is just talking to Lestat now. Like when toward the end of the episode, he walks out of his apartment and you hear him. because we're from the perspective of people watching him across the street, and you can just hear him having a conversation with himself, is what it looks like, because nobody's there. The dude is basically insane, or Lestat is really just a magical being who can kind of appear in his mind.
And again, and you know, some of the things Lestat is saying are very Lestat, but they're not like it's obviously Louis imagining this. So it's also Louis,
It becomes
um,
more clear that that's the case as the episode
yeah,
goes on.
yeah. And his insecurities and his like yeah, and his concerns about the things going on with Armand. So I also do one of the other things I do love about this episode is we finally get a little bit of Armand's backstory, which is pretty tragic.
Super
But
tragic. That was a very touching scene where he
and that was a
takes,
hard scene.
yeah.
Yeah.
And that comes the night after they've had this scene in a restaurant where Santiago goes after Louis. Louis is like excitedly telling Claudia about some photography exhibit he went to or something. And Santiago does that aping thing of him where he can say everything that Louis is saying as he says it. I guess because he's like lightly telepathically taking everything out of his head and saying it at the same time as him. I thought that was a pretty crazy effect. It was cool the way that they did that. But he's obviously just trying to get a rise out of Louis, and Louis takes the bait, and they're at a restaurant, like a busy, crowded restaurant, and Armand has to like flex and
Mm-hmm.
send everybody to sleep or send the vampires to sleep, and all the
Mm-hmm.
people in the restaurant are frozen. And Louis actually has Santiago's tongue in his hand, like he's gonna pull it out, which I was
Yeah.
curious. It didn't seem like Santiago was trying to stop that, but also seemed really uncomfortable. And he's been described as one of the strongest vampires. And so I was curious. Louis has never, in anything that I've ever read in the Anne Rice canon, been described as particularly strong. Like he's always been kind of one of the weaker vampires.
Yeah. So that was kind of interesting that they're going that route, but yeah,
Or it's just that Santiago can't do anything because Armand is there. Maybe I don't know.
maybe.
But so that is the scene the night before. The next day, Armand takes Louis to the Louvre, and Louis calls him out that it's a Lestat sort of flex to do this.
Yep.
Um,
Though it can't be the Louvre because the Venus de Milo is not there, but not in that particular room, not the way they have it set up. But I would imagine they weren't able to actually film in that room.
it was the
So,
40s. So
ah,
sure.
man, sure. But it's in a room kind of like in the middle at the end by itself for the most part. So, but anyway, it's cool that they're in there. I like that they're using it as a scene. Um,
But we get to
and
also
that,
see the painting.
mhm.
Then I had, I've got this kind of vaguely in my memory banks, and I think I'd referred to Marius being a painter. And we get to hear Armand's origin story, if you will. And it's really tragic that he was a slave, basically, who was like traded to Marius, I don't know, and then like kept on as staff for several years before being turned, which he probably. What's interesting about this story is that he was only 15 when he was brought on or sold to Marius,
Mhm.
which is only 1 year older than Claudia.
Yep.
And it's kind of but then he wasn't turned for, I think he said 7 years, so he's in his 20s, which I guess is fine. But for the grace of Marius goes he as a teenage vampire, which would have been a bad thing too. And for whatever reason I always have it in my head that he was a kid, but I think that what they're doing here is canonically accurate, right? Like that he was brought on as a kid and then not turned until later.
So I thought that part of it was that he looked like I think he might have been 17 in the books.
When he was turned.
So in the book, Armand was 17 when he was turned, and part of it was that the intention Marius had him there as like one of his sort of cadre of boy models and sort of sex workers, I guess, or like
Mhm.
muses, whatever you might want to call it. And intended to wait until Armand was older, but could not, so made him a vampire when he was 17. And that's like the whole thing that is a little weird. I think they probably aged him up here to make it not so weird that he was upset about Claudia. But that was definitely sort of a slight bone of contention in the books was that he was pretty young and is taking issue with Claudia, except Claudia in the books is like 8 or 9 or something.
5, I think, based
Oh,
on the
sorry,
wiki.
5. Okay.
Yeah. So young.
Yeah, so there you go. And so anyway, but it is keeping the whole theme where Armand has never felt or often did not feel like he had agency. He's always looking for authority in other things. So, he was basically had no power, was like sold into slavery, then was, put into a brothel. Then Marius got him. I'm not sure that that was the whole backstory in the books because I don't remember, but I do know when he was with Marius, there was just a whole dynamic there where he was still basically under the power of Marius. And when that ended, and they like this is like the whole sort of like I don't know, what do you want to call it? Vampire community, whatever you call them. They did not like how Marius was acting. Like they thought he was a heretic and wanted to take him down. And so then Armand is, of course, looking for more authority from other places. And I guess that's why he went to London or sorry, to Paris with no fight and is happy to carry out these laws because he's constantly looking for authority and doesn't like to sort of come up with his own thoughts.
Yeah, it's
He's
weird though that he's the most powerful person in town, but is obeying rules that who would really have a problem with him if he broke the rules, if he is the only coven in town, like that's
right.
kind of the question I have.
Well, and I mean, I think it's a little bit, when he was made and his master was burned, and there's like, okay, well, that's how it is. So I'm gonna like do that to other people. I don't know.
So one of the things that I think they mentioned in this episode, or Armand during the telling of the story, they set fire to the studio, they set fire to my maker. But he doesn't say he was killed. And Marius comes back, or at least is like the goal of a search later on
Yes,
in
they
some of
do
the
find
stories.
him. They
So I
do find
think
him, but
he's still around. And there's a chance because of the way he said they set fire to him. They didn't destroy him or they didn't kill him. That maybe he's around in this version of the telling also.
but Armand, at least in the books, does not know that. He thinks Marius is dead.
Okay.
And so when he does come back and they are reunited, it's a big deal. Because, Marius did not, you know, come to Armand's rescue. And Armand also, I think, was punished. So there's some stuff, and maybe they're leaving this out deliberately. He was basically punished for sort of his association with Marius, and maybe they brainwashed him, and that's why he was so eagerly, I don't know, eagerly compliant to go and run the Paris coven. Maybe he's terrified. I don't know, but
Well, speaking
anyway.
of brainwashing, there's certainly a thread of that in this episode. And we've
Hmm.
we've suspected that Armand has done something to Louis's memories.
Yep.
And now I think we can kind of I'm feel maybe it's gonna come out that it's like more of a drug-addled brain thing with Malloy, but Malloy has been messed with. He's having these
Yep.
flashbacks in this episode of Armand's face, kind of saying something to him about how he was a real jerk and did some nasty things. Yeah, had some sort of like sexual power play with a woman. Uh, it looks like there's daylight in the window behind Armand in these
Yep.
flashbacks, or maybe that's a street light. I don't know. But there's some really weird stuff going on, and he keeps blinking and saying like I've got a migraine. This is kind of un-Malloy behavior. This guy,
Hmm.
I feel like, is more suspicious and aggressive than the way he's acting here, which is also interesting. Like it's a decision in the way that they're doing this performance that I think is quite fascinating. What do you think about these scenes? What do you make of them?
Well, I like them because it sort of it's supporting some of the stuff that we're seeing play out between Armand and Louis. And then we're seeing Malloy's not stupid and he's picking up on it and he's getting really disturbed by it. And some of the flashbacks show like a woman's body or somebody's body in like
I think the person
plastic.
has a
And
mustache, so I think it's a man,
is it a guy?
maybe.
And
It's through it's hard to tell through the plastic.
Um, but you definitely feel like everything that's playing out in that room isn't what it seems. And one of the more interesting moments is when they're going through the box of photographs, and then like Louis is just like, oh, those aren't even mine. These are all famous photographers' work. And he gets really upset because he didn't put them in the box or doesn't think he did. And then Armand's just kind of like, oh, must have been the staff. Like it's a lot of like gaslighting and weirdness.
Yeah,
Um,
I agree with the
and
gaslighting.
and then, Malloy's picking up on this in and also slips a little bit because he's been, as they've been going through down these like memory lanes, has also been doing research into the files that the Talamasca left on his laptop, and mentions the fire at the theater, and they both snap to because that wasn't in anything that they had provided to him. Both of
Right,
them
but he has
immediately
the
perk
internet.
up.
Like you can't
Well,
Google
right.
Theater de Vampire 1940s and be like, "Oh yeah, there's a
Well, and
record of it."
he like comes up with some pretty slick cover, but it's clear
Yeah.
they don't really believe it. And then and then there's just sort of like a lot of surveillance surrounding Armand, Louis, and including Malloy. And so there's things that are popping up. And so I think that these little breadcrumbs that they're throwing in here are helpful because I think obviously it's gonna play out as the rest of the season goes on. There's definitely a mystery here that Malloy now feels like this is a little bit of a deeper and layered story than I think he thought, and the story is more about him than I think he thought. So um, I'm kind of excited to see how this unravels. And we're not even like we're seeing what's happening with Claudia. We're seeing her interactions with some of the other people in the coven, specifically Santiago.
He was still
Um,
being really shady. He's so nice to her and so calculating with the others that
mhm.
it's like when you know somebody who's always talking trash about other people in your social circle and you're just like, man, I know that means you're doing it about me behind my back too.
Yeah.
You know? So he's
Um,
he's like when he finds her journaling and then it's just like, you're lucky it was me, it wasn't one of the other people or Armand
mhm.
or Estelle or Celeste. But he's so tight with those other with I forget which one he's tight with, Celeste, Estelle.
Celeste.
I feel like he's been tight with both of them interchangeably over the years. But yeah, he acts so kind to her. He reads her journal, but gives it back to her or parts of it. But
Yep.
by the end of the episode, when he finds other journals, he's much more interested.
Yeah, and he sets up the whole idea that they can read them really quickly, which he does. But there's definitely that like, oh, I'm gonna cover for you in this instance. So he's trying
Hmm.
to build trust with her. But I mean, he's so creepy and he does such a great job at this particular um this interaction between the two of them. And it plays right into when they go into Louis' apartment to basically gather evidence, is what I'm assuming.
Yeah,
And um
evidence of Lestat's murder, more than likely.
I don't know if it's that or evidence that they've broken the law.
Well, which is the law
And
breaking. And the thing is with that, with when he finds her journaling, he's like, you know how many other times I've broken the great laws, yada yada yada. Like he's downplaying it
mhm,
for inevitably showing up and being like, I've got evidence that they've broken the laws, like to the coven. So I think it's smart. And Ben Daniels continues to be really good in this role
right.
and in these scenes.
And then the other thing is though is that he's really challenging Armand at every turn about Louis. Every moment he can, he brings up the fact that Louis is out in public,
Hmm.
and the rest of the vampires or the rest of the coven are pretty upset about that too. Where it's like, why does he get to thwart the laws, and you're not just only thwart the laws, but seemingly it with Armand's complete blessing. Um, so again, there is unrest there, and there's definitely going to be a power play. Um, and it is kind of you feel the tragedy for Claudia because she hasn't found somebody within this coven that she really does connect with, which I do think is why she goes out seeking it somewhere else, which is, she ends up connecting with the seamstress again, and they connect over their um, isolation. And these two have a pretty good scene together, which is really nice. And then Claudia explains like, oh, my growth is stunted because it was like 2 years before I think that she had seen her. The seamstress had seen her, and she's like, you still haven't basically hit puberty yet. And so Claudia plays this off in okay way, but her connection with this person and the fact that she's out kind of on her own, getting her dress, Armand is tipped off and really upset about it. And so
Why do you think?
um I think that they have rules kind of about like everybody's always people other than Armand, people aren't out there doing their own thing.
Mm,
They're the coven, it's almost like they're all always watching out or monitoring each other. And so I think that's a piece of it. I think he's always on the lookout and maybe even hopeful for Claudia's downfall. And so I think a little bit of this is like, well, I he knows how important this is to her. He knows she hasn't connected with anybody in the coven. He knows how isolated she is, and I think this is just like a continued, um, just a continued theme to kind of bring about her downfall. And you know, we know he knows a lot about Lestat's death, and in this case, he finally reveals that to her, and she freaks out, rightly so. And I have to say, part of her outrage and her like fear and everything else that she unleashes upon Louis is warranted because Louis is like the only person that she has really trusted. And to find out that Armand now knows this, that they're at risk, that maybe her place in the coven's at risk, or you know, and that also that Louis trusts Armand so much that they're kind of coupled off. And
mm,
it's true, she chose the coven, and Louis is not wrong about that. But I think she felt that their bond was unbreakable and that their bond, I mean, they were sort of the survivor, not sort of, they were the survivors of this abusive dynamic with Lestat. And so I think that this was so incredibly hurtful when she realized that um, perhaps his bond with Armand was more than she thought. So yeah, it's going to be interesting. And so I like look, when I said that this episode was a little slow, it was, but I think that it revealed and built a lot of tension and a lot of like real conflict and backstory that is I suspect is going to really pay off
nice.
as we go.
Yeah, I agree. There was also the subplot of Louis kind of like coming to the conclusion that he's not a gifted artist and being,
Yeah.
meeting with like a buyer or a collector or maybe a fellow artist who was kind of like, yeah, your work is mid, and he gets really angry about it.
Yeah.
Like uh these kinds of moments that are just shattering his the reality he's been building for himself. And then the scene where he, toward the end of the episode, giving Santiago, they've had their big fight, Louis and Claudia. She's stormed out. He's yelling at her. They're having their like 15th yelling match about being vampires in their apartment, which I'm just like, this is
Hmm.
crazy. He goes out. He's with Lestat. They're chatting. He's like, let's go hunt. They've been finishing each other's sentences and stuff in this episode. It's kind of a really cool way that they set this up. They go out to the park and sit in the rain. And then as he's talking with a stat about breaking up with Armand, but really he's talking about breaking up with Lestat's
Hmm.
ghost. And the way that
Yeah.
they do that with the effects of the rain kind of washing the ghost away, I thought was super cool. These two actors, Jacob Anderson and Sam Reed, sorry,
Yeah.
uh, have such great chemistry when they do scenes together. I'm really happy that Lestat can still be in this season, even if he might not. He may show up in the flesh later, but just as the specter of himself and maybe a figment of Louis' imagination and conscience. He's doing. They have such great on screen chemistry that they're so much fun to watch together. And I thought that this scene was really well done. And by the end of it, like Lestat's been washed away, and Armand and Louis are kind of like coming up with a plan for the future. But it all feels like it's on very cracky foundation. Louis is like, look, I used to be a pimp. He doesn't say that, but he's like, I used to run things. I can
Yeah.
run. I can be the new maitre. And Armand even calls
Right.
him that in this conversation. Meanwhile, though, Santiago is digging up the dirt, and it's probably gonna. None of these plans are gonna go well.
Go well. I
Is
mean, I think the other thing though is that that is also the difference between it's like they flip flop back and forth between who's dominant and not, and they talk a little bit about that in the after,
Yeah.
like the after the episode. Um, so that's kind of an interesting thing where they both kind of flip, like who's manipulating who or who's dominating who. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the next episode. The other thing I was going to say, again, it's this show is so beautiful in the way that they shoot it, and especially in these scenes in the rain. It's so film noir. They even have Armand kind of dressed up in like this very classic like coat with the hat in the rain, and it's
Yeah.
really beautiful and diffused, and um like the lighting is absolutely gorgeous throughout this episode, and it has been throughout the series, but this particular episode it just was, you know, if you want to like play out kind of a tragic love story in Paris, and a lot of it felt that way, like a lot of rain and a lot of like mistiness. Um, so that was kind of I've made me want to go to Paris.
Hmm.
So so this is continued, like the production level of this show is really like gorgeous, and it's honestly when you read those books, one of the beautiful things about them is the detail that Anne Rice puts into talking about the different cities that people are experiencing, and she does it with New Orleans and Paris and San Francisco, and so I really love that that is what some of the focus of this show is, to really have them in the setting, and just really it's like a love story, a love letter to these different cities. So
Yeah, that's a
that's
good
kind of
point.
nice.
There is such a great sense of place in her books,
Hmm.
and it does feel like it's carrying over, even though this season is all shot in Prague, I think.
I
Um,
know, and I'm aware of that, but I still was like, they got the idea, you know.
yeah.
So um, even if it's just the interactions between them. There's a lot about like where they're filming on like little tree-lined streets, so it's not so obvious maybe where they are,
Yeah. And
but
they're finding, there's still that kind of old construction building of that you can
yeah,
find it only in Europe, really.
right.
That it's looking great. This show is good. I feel like we both have been coming into these episodes like, wow, that was another bit of a slog, but it's not like a slog that isn't enjoyable. It's just it's just a bit of a slower thing than we're used to, I think, in the genre that we are used to talking
Uh,
about.
I hope I haven't been like misinterpreted, but I'm okay with a slow burn, and I think it's deliberate, and so I do like how they're taking the time and attention to build these stories and build these complex like backstories and characters. So and even with the interactions between Louis and Lestat's, like the ghost or the imaginary Lestat, I mean, even with Louis, like, when people are gone, there's a tendency to romanticize or to, um, I don't know, like it's your perspective about who they were. And um, you know, Louis has long been fighting, like, talking about all the negative stuff about Lestat, but you can see in these like kind of almost self-dialogues that there was also a lot of love there, which he's reluctant to admit, but it's there. Um, and but he's admitting to himself. It's kind of an interesting concept, just this whole interaction between him and Figment Lestat. And so I'm curious to see what happens. And, again, spoiler or not, or for those who know, but Lestat will be making an appearance. He's got to be doing it soon. So it will be interesting to see that this imaginary Lestat that he's built or let go or whatever it is, what happens now that he's confronted with the real one.
And how
So,
different those performances will be from the guy
right,
playing Lestat.
right. So
Yeah.
I'm excited.
Yeah. There's still some really cool storytelling to come in this season. I don't know how many more episodes we can expect. I think it's 8 total, and we're
Yeah,
at
I think it's
4.
8.
So we're halfway
Hmm.
through. But it does feel like things are coming to a head for the Coven, and so I wonder where else the story will take us if the Coven story gets finished off in the next episode or two. That still leaves a little bit of room. And things are also heating up in Dubai. Like what's going to happen with all this Talamasca stuff? There's a lot of cool threads here, so
Hmm.
we'll follow them. And I hope you'll come along and follow them with us. And if you have other thoughts about what is going on in this episode or other episodes of the interview show, give us an email at reanimated podbean what at reanimatedpodcast@gmail.com. And all of our episodes are hosted online at reanimated.podbean.com, and you can have a listen to any of the other ones that we've done there. So thank you for listening, and toodaloo.
Yeah, until next time. Ciao, and thanks for listening, or whatever I say.
Perfect. Nailed it on all accounts.
Yeah.